Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out here. Take my hand as we saunter through this somber place. I hope you don't mind this certain someone guiding us to the site of interest. They seem to be searching for something, as am I. Somewhere on this island lies a machine so unfathomably complex, yet so instrumental in preserving tradition. It's a remarkable machine, but nevertheless, a daunting one. And for that reason, your courage is commendable. I will say, with you being who you are, there's a good chance you've witnessed such a machine before. What we're searching for looks something like this. Does this apparatus seem at all familiar to you? Well, either way, your relationship with it will be much more intimate after tonight's journey. Tonight, we will crystallize the true significance of this machine and the fanatical characters that praise it so highly, perhaps just as highly as I do. As some of you are already aware of, any opportunity to dissect Franz Kafka's works is beyond irresistible to me. And thus, here we are. This machine and those characters are vital to one of Franz Kafka's short stories by the name of In the Penal Colony. You may also recognize this as the title of the first chapter of Resident Evil Revelations 2. Fascinating, and even more so, that each of the 4 chapters is titled after one of Kafka's works, the last of which we've already scrutinized some time ago. That work is a novella titled The Metamorphosis. We examined its many potential parallels to the Wesker children and Oswell E. Spencer. Beyond that work's parallels to this game are those of the previous 3 chapters. And tonight, we have the first. And after tonight, you will never see Revelations 2 or Alex Wesker in quite the same light that you do now. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get bloody.
Fear requires an audience and a conductor.
Just a little further, and that machine will be in sight. But before we arrive, I should frame the impending analysis. It's one thing to view each chapter of Revelations 2 as an individual tale with its own connections to Kafka's works, but it's another to interpret the entirety of Rev 2 as a biohazard-infused iteration of the archetypal Kafka novel. But these 2 modes of interpretation aren't mutually exclusive. Every single chapter of this entry draws inspiration from Kafka's works, some more well-known than others, but altogether, the literary connections here are a treasure trove hiding in plain sight. Or are they? Are the parallels between the game and the literature even worth scrutinizing to the capacity that I so often do? Or are they merely superficial connections, perhaps relevant in a visual sense, but not quite in a thematic or narrative sense? What is it precisely about these stories that aligns so nicely with Alex Wesker's methods? Well, perhaps the greatest compliment I could bestow on this game, having read all these works and having made the connections that I have thus far, is that it boasts a very distinct allure next to the rest of the series, which holds true for the game on its own, but its allure is wonderfully complemented by its many parallels to Kafka's books. This is all made possible due to the villain and her seemingly unrestricted control over the plot.
Are you afraid? You can tell me. Talk to me.
Not one RE villain boasts an aura quite as commanding as Alex Wesker, as her objectives and her essence permeate every facet of the ongoing narrative. Most Resident Evil entries begin by anchoring themselves to the protagonists, and have you navigate the grounds of interest through their eyes, with their limited knowledge, very much akin to a third-person limited perspective of a novel, many instances of which are nicely exemplified by the S.D. Perry novels. During these early phases of the games, the presence of antagonistic energies is all but undetectable, save for mindless forces that serve as lesser obstructions, such as BOWs and perplexing mechanisms, and sometimes an ambiguous third-party agent that crumbles in the crossfire, like Ricardo Irving, Ben Bertolucci, Louis Serra, and others. The real villains are far more elusive than these lesser obstructions. As established through multiple of my previous analyses, Resident Evil features at least one character of the treacherous ally archetype in almost every entry. These characters slither alongside the heroes under the guise of cooperation, usually driven by avarice, especially in the earlier entries. When the time is ripe, they inevitably backstab the heroes in a final confrontation of clashing objectives. Only then are their true intentions exposed, and only then can they truly be deemed antagonists. Albert Wesker, Chief Irons, Ada Wong, and Nikolai Zinoviev are the classic examples of these, as are Frederick and Wilson in Degeneration and Infinite Darkness, respectively. However, the presence of these characters is never meant to dominate the ongoing narrative, in fact much the opposite. Their goal is to avoid drawing attention, to refrain from arousing any further suspicion that the protagonists may already sense around them, if any. Unlike some of the later villains, they simply lack the raw power to deal with the repercussions of being caught, so they wear their masks because they have to. For this reason, the heroes drive forth the plot's momentum instead, making for a hero-centric narrative in which the antagonist's mask only chips and peels away towards the final chapters. This is the playbook that the treacherous allies play by. These are the narrative rules of the classical Resident Evil villains. But Revelations 2 shatters these rules and several others of the RE formula with it, deliberately, mercilessly.
Fear what you will become, and become what you fear.
It simply doesn't necessitate any characters of this treacherous archetype. It is overtly, unapologetically, villain-centric and villain-driven from the very beginning. This is wholly necessary to accomplish Alex's aims. She commands this exalted rank of power and control above other villains. Her objectives warrant a higher, more complex level of puppeteering. As you'll learn tonight, she deviates far away from the RE formula by almost every imaginable measure. Resident Evil typically grants the heroes a sense of agency, as their decision to travel to the site of interest and investigate is made willingly. But Alex saps them of this agency immediately by abducting the heroes, administering them her horrid gift, and actively drooling over their bouts of panic and despair. Keep this initial incident, or the arrest as I like to call it, in mind, as it is critical to understanding Kafka's influence on Revelations 2. She zestfully explains the rules of her game and how the protagonists are mere pawns in her study of T-Phobos, a virus that directly responds to levels of fear and stress in the host. In this entry, the element of fear is not merely an abstract obstacle for the protagonists. It is a tangible gauge of one's capacity to mutate and cease to be human, as displayed by the bracelets. Fear itself is the threat above all others. It is the very lifeblood of Alex's modus operandi. Alex's playground is beyond perilous. It's humiliating and ridicules you for your own incompetence. It materializes fear as a suffocating sense of inadequacy that compounds upon itself, becoming a deeper shade of vermilion with every additional ounce of the sufferer's woes. And just as a final affront to the conventional formula, she triumphs in both ending scenarios. There is no good ending this time. There is only an ever so slightly better ending. Completely irrespective of your actions, she succeeds in transferring to her meticulously selected vessel, Natalia, again breaking the rules, and again laughing at all other RE villains who perish, or at least appear to do so, in the final scenes of their debut entry, as is typically the case. It's as if she herself directed the title and has been granted full creative freedom from Yasuhiro Anpo, and gladly rejected Resident Evil's original formula to instead respond to an irresistible surge of adoration, fervor, and admiration that she felt for Franz Kafka and his immortal legacy of puzzling works. In those works lies the key to understanding her oppressive puppeteering. And so, with a notably altered formula, a relentlessly domineering villain with her own rulebook, and a puzzling set of Kafka stories that thematically back her aims, we have a new breed of Resident Evil storytelling. Revelations 2 dares to be grander and more profound by baking Kafka's works into its narrative, and whether that daring was worth it is the question of the night. But the fact that it attempts this at all, of course, has me invested. So finally, let's dive further into his influence on Alex and the narrative at large. According to the secret game file, Alex's thoughts on Franz Kafka, Alex aims to harness fear as a means of controlling this hellish world, and describes Kafka's works as being full of madness and despair, and the emotions born of fear. If you are at all familiar with Kafka's works, you might deem Alex's description too trivial to sufficiently describe the underlying themes of his works, but it does suffice to summarize her own aims in terms of T-Phobos and the bracelets. She writes, "Fear is born from human instinct, and it's the basic emotion that keeps us alive. Those who control fear control life itself." This very philosophy and the challenge of harnessing fear, as you can see, is enacted by T-Phobos as the bracelets measure the hormones adrenaline and norepinephrine in the hosts. But make no mistake, the more nuanced array of themes that distinguish Kafka's writing, or as Alex says, the emotions born of fear, such as unchallengeable guilt, bafflement, powerlessness, alienation, negligence, and solitude, are also present in this narrative, and interestingly enough, the original Japanese version of this file encapsulates this array of emotions a tad differently than the English localization. The English version seems to frame our understanding of his works through fear and the emotions born of it, which, admittedly, does fall more in line with T-Phobos, while the Japanese file notes the immense value in fighting and conquering fear, which is often embodied by the courage in Kafka's protagonists, despite the peril of their circumstances. We'll see very soon just how courageous our heroes dare to be. These literary connections are fascinating to a degree you wouldn't believe, on a level that warrants sentences upon sentences of framing and setup, which should come not as a surprise from me, but as an expectation for me. This project had 3 headers to frame its main event, and tonight's has a couple, and in both cases, the framing is fully necessary to receive my message in its entirety. It's only worth creating for those who really, truly seek to understand and learn and attempt to absorb every last detail. Now, let's proceed. Alex's playground is a bothersome one, a deplorable one that houses the machine of interest. But if you'll ride the swings and slide the slide tonight, I'll show you just how fun and profound it truly is. That machine draws near, but our journey really starts here with the arrest. Yes, this analysis is meant to focus on Ch.1 in Kafka's novella, In the Penal Colony, but I wouldn't dare deprive you of how Kafka's signatures, his essence at large, manifests before this chapter even begins, and to illuminate such signatures, I want to draw your attention to the scene of Claire and Moira's abduction. These two, and a number of their comrades, are inexplicably detained by forces beyond their knowledge and taken to a desolate, Soviet-style prison. The heroes awake in their lonely prison cells, perplexed beyond belief. Moira's perplexity materializes in one crucial inquiry. "What did we do?" she asks.
None of this makes any sense. What did we do?
She does not ask, "What the hell happened?" or "Where are we?" but instead she asks, "What did we do?" As in, what are we guilty of? What are we being charged with? When the overseer speaks to them, she elusively feeds them little nuggets of information, but does not respond directly to their inquiries, leaving their confusion to fester and multiply, and thus inducing panic and despair. And it is this aura of utter bewilderment that mirrors the themes of perplexity and unchallengeable guilt in many of Kafka's signature stories. Consider The Trial. This story, much like The Metamorphosis as well, begins with an individual caught in a suffocating predicament of a deeply puzzling nature in his own home. The Trial tells of a man, Joseph K., who is arrested one morning for no reason at all by authorities that have no warrant to his quarters and no basis for his detainment, yet they claim that his arrest cannot be contested.
Quite honestly, I can't remember a single offense that could be charged against me.
In this first chapter, which is fittingly titled The Arrest, Joseph's captors tell him that the proceedings have been set in motion and you will be told everything at the appropriate time, and that you are not allowed to leave. You are our prisoner. Fascinating. Just as the guards in The Trial detain the individual and speak in vagaries to elude the charge in question, Claire and Moira are confined to these lonely cells acting as prisoners themselves, much like Joseph, befuddled by the inexplicable nature of their arrest. And like the guards, Alex Wesker evades their questions and leaves them in a labyrinth of monstrous complexity to work through, filled with grisly beasts rather than lowly, drone-like guards and officials in disgustingly inconvenient public spaces, like in the trial. It is essentially a reimagining of the trial's first chapter, the arrest, in the universe of Resident Evil, while Joseph's pursuit to win his trial is plagued by the disharmony of a deeply dysfunctional, almost comically flawed and ever-vigilant bureaucratic system. Claire and Moira's journey is more so a primal test of courage, a visceral gauge of their ability to endure fear and despair, in which they also suffer from a constant vigil. This vigil is not orchestrated by a nebulous network of corrupt bureaucrats like it is in the trial, but by Alex's bracelets, which cruelly reflect the waning emotional fortitude of her test subjects, who grapple with their own trial against fear itself, much like Franz Kafka's The Trial should be conceptualized as a trial against the court as an institution, or even a trial against trials. And both types of trials, against fear and against the court itself, gradually whittle down the sanity of the individual, challenging their sense of reason, of what is just and right.
Can you tell me how to get out of here? I've had enough of this place.
You're going already, but you have hardly seen anything yet.
I don't want to. I just want to get out of here.
Oh, Claire, I just want to go home.
It's okay. We're gonna get out of here.
There's a lot here in the trial. Perhaps it'll arise again sometime in our series of analyses of Kafka's works in relation to Revelations 2. The prison environment is the perfect complement to Kafka's themes of unchallengeable guilt, of condemnation, of an incomprehensible, fatal nature. These themes, along with the many additional parallels to the trials that we've established thus far, reemerge in the real focus of tonight's analysis, in the Penal Colony. Now, it is time for the main event. This is In the Penal Colony. 4 figures, the explorer, the officer, the soldier, and the prisoner, are our company tonight. This story, much like the trial, follows the plight of a fatally condemned man who, once again, never comes to know of the charge against him, and yet his captor holds the unflinching conviction that the prisoner, restrained by a soldier and awaiting execution, doesn't deserve to know his sentence. His captor is dubbed the officer, the conductor of penal matters. He explains to the foreign visitor, or the explorer, the execution ceremony for this prisoner, which involves this apparatus, in full detail. And this apparatus is the remarkable machine I alluded to earlier. Here we are, in its presence. This tale largely revolves around the explorer's dialogue with the officer, as the officer explains with great fervor all the nightmarish intricacies of this machine before the prisoner is due for execution. The aforementioned themes of incontestable guilt, of fatal condemnation are present here as well. When the explorer asks the officer, in regard to the prisoner's fate, he doesn't know the sentence that has been passed on to him, the officer replies, no, there would be no point in telling him. He'll learn it on his body. Which precisely is the function of this machine. The harrow is the middle portion that inscribes the sentence of the condemned on their bare skin using its fine needles. The upper portion is called the designer, while the lower piece, on which the condemned are fastened with straps, is known as the bed. While the sufferer is restrained atop the bed, a felt gag is fitted into his mouth to prevent him from screaming and biting his tongue. The officer eventually states that the most important components of this machine are the cogwheels and the designer, which function in accordance to the inscriptions demanded by the sentence. This parallel speaks for itself, really, as the cogwheel rests just underneath the hero as a puzzle piece when Claire and Moira encounter the same apparatus. But later tonight, these cogwheels will re-emerge in a new light. As the officer goes on and on with his exhaustive exposition, the prisoner cannot comprehend a word of it due to the language barrier, and thus lays shackled in anxious anticipation. A similar sense of dreadful unknowing plagues Alex's prisoners as they cautiously emerge from their cells, like lambs to the slaughter, perplexed by her enigmatic mutterings. Alex's foreboding words are delivered through their bracelets, which themselves are akin to the shackles of the prisoner, and like the prisoner, Claire and Moira await an unknown sentence. Alex elusively says,
So much suffering. You don't even know what to be afraid of yet.
which, much like the officer in this story, is her way of withholding the sufferers from knowing their own sentence. Moira responds,
Is she talking to us or at us?
which mimics the enigmatic barrier between officer and prisoner even further. Much like Joseph in the trial, the explorer is the voice of the courageous, rational individual in the face of madness. He pleads on the prisoner's behalf, saying, "But he must have had some chance of defending himself," to which the officer replies, "My guiding principle is this: guilt is never to be doubted." Here again is that recurring theme of indisputable guilt to executions marked by incomprehensible complexity. The officer then tells us that under the sovereignty of the current ruler, known as the present commandant, his beloved execution method is in jeopardy, as unlike the former commandant, this ruler did not approve of this ceremony and was poised to decommission this archaic form of execution. The officer cries, "I was the former commandant's assistant in all penal matters and know more about the apparatus than anyone." He claims that under the rule of the former commandant, each execution was amply funded, the machine diligently serviced with new straps to restrain the condemned, new gags to muffle his screaming, and new components to ensure that the sentence was immaculately inscribed upon the body of the guilty. But the new commandant reallocated these funds and resources, leaving the officer to reuse the same felt gag, which inevitably produced nausea on the prisoner, the same broken and failing restraints, and a blood-stained machine overdue for cleaning and maintenance. You see, this new commandant had no intention of revitalizing the old fervor and splendor that once surrounded these executions. Allow me to share with you that fervor in the golden age of the former commandant. This is where the parallels to Revelations 2 reach new heights, so pay close attention to this figure. In the days of the former commandant, he himself would lay the condemned man under the harrow for the execution ceremony. An entire day before the ceremony, hundreds of spectators would rally emphatically, awaiting the justice that needed to be dealt. It was a great honor for the officer to then conduct the execution, the machine meticulously cleaned and ready with fresh components. No high official dared to absent himself. No discordant noise spoiled the working of the machine. Many did not care to watch it, but lay with closed eyes in the sand. They all knew. Now justice is being done. The officials were flooded with requests to observe the machine's work from nearby. Of course, more requests than could possibly be granted. How we bathed their cheeks in the radiance of that justice, achieved at last and fading so quickly. "What times these were, my comrade!" exclaimed the officer. Fascinating. A fanatical audience observing a calculated, deliberate conductor. Does this sound familiar to you?
Fear requires an audience and a conductor.
Is this wondrous ceremony, filled with hundreds of vehement spectators and emphatically executed by an all-powerful conductor, what Alex is alluding to? Is Alex not that conductor herself, and is her audience not the zealous townsfolk who practically worship her as a goddess? In Kafka's story, the officer explains that the adherents of the former commandant were plentiful during his reign, but consequently the adherents have skulked out of sight. There are still many of them, but none of them will admit it. This divisive reputation of the former commandant is very much akin to the islanders' collective perception of Alex Wesker. Sign Island, formerly part of the Soviet Union, suffered a period of severe economic adversity, with its people struggling to find work and uphold their starving families, until Alex rejuvenated its job market, ushering in a renewed wave of opportunity. And for this, the islanders see her as their divine savior, their messiah in a time of destitution. These sentiments are etched all over the island, one of which being the devotion, unity, labor, rich island posters, little nuggets of propaganda that would provide hope to an impoverished community. The devotion aspect is meant to aggrandize Alex as the usher of divine change, even allowing islanders to visit and openly discuss her feelings with her at the monument. But as suspected by some of the villagers, Alex had been capturing and experimenting on their relatives who had been employed in the mines and the research facilities. This discovery and the consequent rumors severely altered their view of their savior, causing the public perception to mutate, much like the Penal Colony's perception of the former commandant after his death, in which any remaining adherents of his grim dealings would no longer express their supportive sentiments openly. Any surviving and remaining adherents of Alex would appreciate her in silence, perhaps enjoying their economic revival in spite of knowing her dark intentions. Regardless of her perception in the public eye, her aspirations of creating a new world order had fostered a small circle of fanatical supporters. At the height of those zealots was Stuart, perhaps her most faithful researcher. And likewise, upholding the former commandant's cherished tradition till the very end was the officer himself. This parallel is a startling one, so let's frame it by continuing with the story. After expositing all this, the officer then implores the explorer to help him against the current commandant, to vouch for this execution method in an effort to preserve it. But the explorer doesn't intend to assist in the way the officer had hoped. He only plans to tell the commandant what he thinks of the procedure in private, and then leave the colony early the next morning. Then suddenly, the officer states, "Then the time has come," and removes the prisoner from the bed of the machine, and tells the prisoner, "You are free." The officer then strips down to his bare skin himself and positions himself underneath the harrow, receiving the felt gag in his own mouth. This judicial procedure held infinitely more value in the officer's eyes than his own life. He would gladly meet his demise for such a cherished practice as this, and for his dear former commandant. In Kafka's story, the machine malfunctions while inscribing on the officer his sentence, multiple cogwheels escaping out of the designer as if being squeezed out. The harrow, then, does not write, it only jabs, stabbing away at the officer in a flurry of scarlet motion. At the end of this maddening sequence, the officer remains viciously impaled by the harrow, hanging from its teeth. The explorer, the prisoner, and the soldier pry his body from the harrow's needles and find a calm, convinced expression on his face, the point of a great iron spike jutting through his forehead. Allow me to rearrange this image in relation to Revelations 2, and reassign the roles of the sufferers and the spectators. Here, under this harrow, lies Stuart, the officer of our tale. Just like the officer's sacrifice to the sacred legacy of his former commandant, Stuart gladly perishes to honor the undying legacy of his dear Alex. As you can see, no price is too high for martyrdom. Stuart's demise is very akin to the officer's act of martyrdom. In the original Japanese file, Stuart's valediction, Stuart congratulates his Lady Alex on her success thus far in preparing for the reincarnation ceremony, which is her mind transfer into Natalia Corda, thus extending her life. Stuart then says, "Being the creator, bringing order to the new world, it is the greatest joy for our compatriots who are tied up with a bond. She was prepared for the sin, the suffering of her birth. And I think that success requires punishment to purify the sin. In order to guide the coming reincarnation ceremony, to share the pain of the birth of Our Lady, I will punish myself and give this life." And thus, Stuart hung himself proudly, dying, assured that the ceremony would conjure a new, better world with Alex as its creator. These two, the officer and Stuart, are martyrs to visions and ideals that would outlive themselves. And speaking of reincarnation, the ending of this story is where the parallel comes full circle. After the officer's gruesome demise in Kafka's story, the explorer, the prisoner, and the soldier all locate the gravestone of the former commandant, which lies underneath a table in a tea house. The inscription on the gravestone reads, "Here rests the old commandant. His adherents, who now must be nameless, have dug this grave and set up this stone. There is a prophecy that after a certain number of years, the commandant will rise again and lead his adherents from this house to recover the colony. Have faith and wait." And interestingly, such a prophecy of rebirth of the former commandant is also reflected by Alex's reincarnation ceremony, in which she'd be reborn through Natalia. She says to Natalia,
6 months from now, you're going to awaken as me.
The concept of adherence once again alludes to both the former commandants and Alex's small circle of fanatical supporters, servants ready to sacrifice anything for their master, but who must also remain hidden in the current order. Alex's wish to become creator and establish true order seems quite reflective of the verbiage, "The commandant will rise again and lead his adherents from this house to recover the colony. Have faith and wait." And so, this essentially concludes the notable parallels between Alex and the former commandant, Stewart and the officer, and our heroes and the prisoner, respectively. In both Kafka's story and Revelations 2, this is a story of unwavering conviction, of martyrdom, of unfaltering devotion to ideals that cannot be contained.
Fear requires an audience and a conductor.
Thank you for joining us tonight. It's fascinating how the guiding inspiration for Chapter 1 also seems to offer some profound meaning for Revelations 2 at large, especially through the lens of Alex and Stewart. This was one of many Kafka literature analyses, in relation to Resident Evil, to come. There's just always more for us to dissect. In the multiverse of lore comprised of canon novels, non-canon novels, supplemental literature, manga, games, CGI movies, live-action movies, and various other media, it's baffling just how much of Resident Evil's lore is still left to our interpretation. As is evident through my previous analyses, so much of my focus is in fact on character writing and thematic storytelling, and crystallizing the underlying themes that so often serve as the backbone of Capcom's stories, which is sometimes even more pronounced in my Devil May Cry and Onimusha analyses than my Resident Evil ones. And when Resident Evil stories incorporate literature in a similar manner, I can't help but look deeper. Thank you for watching. To make it this far, one must be daring and one must be hungry. My editor and I worked many hours, day and night, to produce this. I hope you enjoyed the phenomenal work he's done here. Special thanks to Dakota for these beautiful art pieces. Special thanks as well to my supporters on Patreon: Mark 5, Andre Novoa, All Things Horror, Tina, Jareel Moon, John Wick, Joseph Whitehouse, Thomas Brunner, Jacob Ramsey, and Randolph. Thank you for going above and beyond to support my content. Be sure to follow me on Twitter for lore tweets, and check the YouTube community tab for updates on my latest projects. I wish you, and our special guest, a good night, full of rain and frights. I'll see you again, I'm sure. Perhaps, just as Alex reawakens.